Imagine this, the streets of the 1950s, filled with cars, all different, yet at the same time, strangely similar. They weren't the fastest, they weren't the most luxurious, and many of them weren't even the most beautiful, but they were the ones everyone bought, the ones on every corner, in every garage, in every ordinary story that almost no one tells. And here's the interesting part. When you understand why these cars sold so much, you don't just understand the cars. You understand an entire generation, because sometimes the most important car of an era isn't the most desired, it's the most chosen. And some of them are going to surprise you. 1957, Chevrolet Bel Air. It didn't just look like a popular car, it looked like a symbol. Chrome everywhere, long, elegant lines, a presence that, even today, still turns heads. But here's what makes it interesting. This car wasn't exclusive, it wasn't rare, it wasn't out of reach, it was the opposite. It was the car people felt they could actually own, and that changed everything. The numbers make it even clearer. In 1957 alone, the Bel Air surpassed 700,000 units produced, a massive figure for the time, especially for a car that wasn't the base model of the lineup. And that's what makes it even more interesting. It wasn't just the cheapest option, it was the car people truly wanted. At a time when the country was experiencing one of its biggest economic expansions, the middle class was growing, and suddenly, owning a beautiful car was no longer an impossible luxury. And Chevrolet understood that better than anyone, because the Bel Air wasn't the cheapest, but it wasn't expensive either. It sat perfectly in that sweet spot, where it looked like more than it actually cost, and that made it irresistible. But here's something important. This wasn't just about looks. Under the hood, there were options that didn't quite match that image of a refined family car. V8 engines, including the famous 283, with numbers that, for the time, were already becoming serious. Over 200 horsepower, and acceleration that, in the 1950s, didn't go unnoticed. But what made it interesting wasn't just what it did, it was how it did it. Because this car didn't shout speed, it delivered it smoothly, without drama, without exaggeration, as if it had nothing to prove. And that's where everything comes together. Because the Bel Air didn't just sell a car, it sold a feeling. The feeling of having reached something better, of having more without looking excessive. And that's why it was everywhere. Not because it was the best at everything, but because it was the perfect balance between desire and reality. And that is exactly what most people were looking for at the time. 1950 Ford Custom Deluxe. This car didn't try to stand out. It tried to be everywhere. And it succeeded, because unlike the Bel Air, there was no excess here. No obvious luxury, no intention to look like more than it was. It was simple, direct, functional, and that's exactly why it worked so well. In the early 1950s, the United States was still settling into the post-war era, and what people were looking for wasn't attention. It was stability, confidence, something that simply worked every day, and Ford understood that perfectly. Because the Custom Deluxe wasn't exciting, but it was exactly the car people needed, and the numbers prove it. In 1950 alone, Ford surpassed 1.1 million passenger cars produced, with the Custom Deluxe being one of the pillars of that volume. It was everywhere. Not because it was special, but because it was accessible, reliable, and easy to maintain. But here's something important. That doesn't mean it was weak. Under the hood, options like Ford's classic flathead V8 produced around 100 horsepower, enough to move the car with ease, without complications. It wasn't fast, it didn't try to be, but it didn't need to, because this car didn't sell speed. It sold peace of mind, the confidence of knowing you would get there every single day without surprises. And that's where the real contrast lies. While some cars tried to stand out, this one simply delivered, and still, it dominated the streets, because sometimes the best-selling car isn't the most exciting one. It's the one that fails the least. 1953 Chevrolet 210. This car lived in a very interesting middle ground. It wasn't the cheapest, but it wasn't the most desirable either. And still, it was one of the most common sights on the streets, because this is where a lot of people made a smart decision. The The Bel Air might have looked better, more elegant, more complete, but the 210 did almost the same for less, and that made it the logical choice. In a time when every dollar mattered, this kind of balance made all the difference, and Chevrolet knew it, because the 210 didn't try to impress, it tried to convince. And it did it very well. The numbers reflect that. In the early 1950s, Chevrolet consistently surpassed 1 million units per year, and the 210 was a key part of that volume. It was everywhere, not because it stood out, but because it fit perfectly into people's lives. But here's where it gets interesting, because this car wasn't as basic as it seemed. Under the hood, inline-six options, and later V8 versions, with power figures exceeding 100 horsepower, enough to offer more than just simple transportation. It wasn't an exciting car, but it had more than it appeared, and that made it even more appealing. Because you weren't paying for image, you were paying for common sense. And that's the contrast. It wasn't the car people dreamed of owning, it was the car people chose to own. And that is far more powerful than it seems. And now things get interesting, because so far, we've seen cars that sold through logic, through balance, through necessity. But the next one is the opposite, a car almost no one remembers today. But at the time, it was everywhere. And here I want to hear your opinion. If you had to choose between something rational, like this 210, or something completely forgotten, but just as present in its time, which one would you pick? Because what comes next doesn't seem important, but it was. 1951. Plymouth Cranbrook. This car didn't try to convince you, or impress you, or even stand out. It simply was there, on every street, in every neighborhood, in every routine. And that wasn't by accident, because Plymouth understood something many brands overlooked. Not everyone wanted to aspire to something more. Many people just wanted something that worked, something reliable, something affordable, something that didn't complicate their lives. And the Cranbrook was exactly that. No excessive chrome, no exaggerated lines, no pretension. A clean design, proper, almost discreet. But here's where it gets interesting, because that simplicity was its greatest strength. The numbers make it clear. In the early 1950s, Plymouth produced hundreds of thousands of units per year, and the Cranbrook was one of its most important models. It wasn't rare, it wasn't special, but it was everywhere. And that says everything. Under the hood, 6-cylinder engines, with just over 90 horsepower, no big numbers, no intention to impress, but with something far more important, durability. This car wasn't built to be fast, it was built to last, to start every morning, without failing, without surprises. And that's where everything comes together, because while other cars tried to stand out, this one became part of everyday life, quietly, without attention, but always present. And that's the strongest contrast of all, because it wasn't the car anyone dreamed of owning, but it was probably the car most people actually had. 1955, Chevrolet 150. This car wasn't built to impress, or to turn heads, or even to look like more than it was, and still, it became one of the most common sights on the streets. Because this is where things get even more interesting. If the Bel Air was the car people desired, and the 210 was the car people chose logically, the 150 was the car that simply made sense. It was the most basic version, the most direct, the most honest in the entire Chevrolet lineup. No excess, no unnecessary details, nothing that wasn't absolutely essential. And that made it extremely attractive to thousands of people, especially for those who needed a car to work. The numbers make it clear, by the mid-1950s, Chevrolet was producing over 1.5 million cars per year, and the 150 was a fundamental part of that volume. Not because it was the most beautiful or the best equipped, but because it was the most accessible. But here's the detail many don't expect, because even as the most basic version, this car could hide more than it seemed. Under the hood, from reliable inline-six engines to V8 options like the 265 with over 160 horsepower, something that, at the time, was already becoming serious. But what's interesting is how it delivered that power. It didn't chase excitement. It didn't aim for spectacle. It simply did its job. It accelerated when it needed to. It responded when you asked it to, without complications. And that's where the real contrast lies, because this car didn't sell an idea. It didn't sell aspiration. It didn't sell emotion. It sold something much simpler, pure functionality. And precisely because of that, it ended up becoming one of the most common cars of the entire decade. Not because people loved it, but because people needed it. 1956 Ford Fairlane. This car wasn't basic, but it wasn't luxury either. And right there is where everything changes. Because the Fairlane lived exactly in that space, where people started looking a little higher. It was no longer just about having a car. It was about having something better, something that said a little more, without going too far. And Ford understood that moment perfectly, because the Fairlane wasn't out of reach, but it clearly wasn't the cheapest option. It had more presence, more detail, more intention to stand out, stronger chrome accents, more elegant lines, a more refined overall feel. It was the kind of car that didn't need to be extreme, to feel different, and that made it very appealing. The numbers confirm it. By the mid-1950s, Ford was producing over 1.4 million cars per year, and the Fairlane positioned itself as one of the most desirable options for the general public. It wasn't the most common, but it was one of the most aspirational within reach. But here's something important. This car wasn't just about looks either. Under the hood, V8 engines like the 292, with around 200 horsepower, offered performance that already felt more serious. It wasn't a sports car, but it was no longer just transportation. It had something extra. It accelerated with more intent, responded better, and above all, felt more complete. And that's where the contrast lies, because the Fairlane wasn't the car you needed. It was the car you started to want. And that, in the 1950s, made all the difference, because it meant you were no longer just getting by. You were moving forward. And now I want to hear from you. So far we've seen cars that simply worked, cars that made sense, and cars that started to feel like a step up. But if you had to choose, would you go with something practical like the 150, or would you make the jump to something like the Fairlane? Because what comes next completely changes the kind of car that dominated the streets. 1957 Ford F100. This wasn't a car, and yet it was everywhere. Because while most people were thinking about sedans, about comfort, about family, this model answered something completely different. Work, real daily use, load, strength. And that's what made it essential. Because in the 1950s, the United States wasn't just growing in cities. It was growing in the countryside, in construction, in everything that demanded effort. And that's where the F100 came in. No pretension, no attempt to look like more, but delivering like few others. Its design was simple, robust, built to last, straight lines, solid structure, everything focused on functionality. But here's what makes it interesting, because even though it wasn't a conventional car, its presence was impossible to ignore. The numbers make it clear. By the late 1950s, Ford was producing hundreds of thousands of pickups per year, and the F100 was one of the key players in that volume. It wasn't a niche, it was a massive necessity. Under the hood, inline-six engines, and V8 options like the 272, with enough power to haul, tow, and work without stopping. It wasn't fast, it wasn't meant to be, but it had something more important: strength, consistency, durability, and that was exactly what its audience needed. Because this wasn't a vehicle to show off, it was a vehicle to rely on. And that's the strongest contrast so far. While other cars focused on comfort, this one delivered utility. While others promised style, this one delivered toughness. And still, it was one of the most present vehicles of the entire decade. Not because people desired it, but because people truly needed it. 1959 Volkswagen Beetle. This car didn't fit into anything you've seen so far. Smaller, simpler, completely different. And yet, it ended up claiming a place no one expected. Because while the United States was filled with big cars, long, flashy, the Beetle did the exact opposite. It didn't try to impress. It didn't try to compete in size or in power. It tried to solve something much simpler, getting you from one place to another using less, and that, at the right moment, changed everything. Because by the late 1950s, a new type of buyer was starting to appear. People who weren't looking for status or presence, but efficiency, economy, practicality, and the Beetle was exactly that. A completely different design, compact, lightweight, almost minimalist, but incredibly functional. And the numbers prove it. By the end of the decade, Volkswagen was already producing hundreds of thousands of units per year, and its presence in the United States was growing rapidly. It wasn't dominant like the American brands, but it was relevant enough to change the conversation. But here's where it gets even more interesting, because under the hood, there was nothing impressive. A small air-cooled flat-4 engine with around 30 horsepower. On paper, it made no sense to compete, but in reality, it did exactly what it promised. It used very little fuel, it rarely failed, and it was incredibly simple to maintain. It wasn't a car that pushed you back in your seat, it was a car that was always ready. And that's the contrast. Because in an era defined by excess, size, and presence, this car succeeded by being the opposite, not because of what it offered more, but because of what it didn't need, and that made it one of the smartest cars of the entire decade. 1957 Dodge Coronet. This car did try to stand out, and it did it from the very first glance. More aggressive, wider, more eye-catching. A design that no longer aimed to be discreet, but to dominate. Because Dodge understood something important. Not everyone wanted something simple, or balanced, or invisible. Some people wanted presence. They wanted to feel like their car said something. And the Coronet did exactly that. Stronger chrome accents, sharper lines, a more planted stance on the road. It wasn't subtle, and it didn't try to be. But here's where it gets interesting, because it wasn't just about looks. The numbers back it up. By the late 1950s, Dodge was producing hundreds of thousands of cars per year, and the Coronet was one of the key pieces in that volume. It wasn't the absolute bestseller, but it was popular enough to be everywhere, especially among those who wanted something different, something with more character. And under the hood, that was clear too. V8 engines like the 325, with figures exceeding 240 horsepower, offered a much stronger response than most regular cars of the time. It wasn't extreme, but it was already moving towards something more serious. It accelerated with intent, responded with more attitude, and delivered a different kind of feeling. It wasn't just transportation, it was personality, and that's the contrast. While many cars on this list succeeded by being logical, this one did it by being emotional, by offering something you didn't need, but wanted. And that, in the middle of so many rational cars, made it stand out even more. 1958 Chevrolet Impala. This car didn't start out dominating, but when it arrived, it completely changed the direction of everything. Because up to this point, we've seen cars that made sense, cars that worked, cars people chose out of necessity or logic. The Impala was something else. From the very first glance, it no longer looked like a typical car. Longer, lower, more striking. A presence that no longer tried to fit in. It aimed to stand out. And it succeeded. Because in 1958, Chevrolet introduced the Impala as a higher-tier version within its lineup. More elegant, more refined, more aspirational. And the response was immediate. The numbers make it clear. In its first year alone, the Impala surpassed 180,000 units produced. A massive number for a model that wasn't the most accessible. And that's what makes it so interesting. Because here, people were no longer buying just out of necessity. They were starting to buy out of desire. And the Impala understood that perfectly. But here's something important. This wasn't just about looks. Under the hood, V8 options like the 348, with over 250 horsepower, delivered performance that was already on another level. It wasn't just a beautiful car. It was starting to become fast. And you could feel it. It accelerated with more force, more intent, with a presence that went beyond visuals. It wasn't subtle, it wasn't discreet, and it didn't want to be. And that's where everything changes, because the Impala didn't sell balance. It didn't sell logic, it didn't sell necessity, It sold something far more powerful: aspiration, the feeling of having something better, of having moved one step forward, and that marked the beginning of a new era. Because from this point on, cars didn't just have to work, they had to make you feel something. And the Impala was one of the first to truly do it. And in the end, when you look at all these cars together, you realize something interesting. None of them were perfect. None of them were the fastest or the most luxurious or the most impressive. And still, they were the ones that dominated the streets, because each one represented something different: necessity, balance, work, aspiration, efficiency. They weren't cars designed to stand out on a list. They were cars designed to fit into real life. And now I'm curious, out of all the ones we saw today, which one do you think was the most important of the 1950s? Not the most beautiful, not the fastest, but the one that truly changed how people chose their cars. Let me know in the comments. And if you want to keep discovering stories like this, you need to watch this next video about the strangest cars of the 1950s, because some of them weren't just different, they were so unusual, they almost disappeared. And when you see them, you'll understand why. I'll see you in the next video.